Hey guys, close your eyes and imagine this for a moment. You wake up in a tiny wooden house with paper walls so thin the winter wind slices through them like a knife. Your bed is nothing more than a straw mat, your stomach already empty, and before your eyes can even adjust to the gray dawn, you're on your feet, working, not because you want to, but because you have no choice. That was life in feudal Japan. A world that looks poetic in paintings and movies, with cherry blossoms floating in the air, moonlit castles rising above the hills, and samurai swords gleaming in the night. But behind the beauty was a life that would crush most of us before the morning sun reached its peak. In our world today, we're told we can grow up to be whatever we want, to chase dreams and choose our path. In feudal Japan, none of that existed. The moment you were born, your role in life was set like ink drying on paper. If your father was a samurai, you were bound to the sword. If your family were farmers, then rice paddies and back-breaking labor defined your destiny. Merchants traded, artisans crafted, monks prayed, and at the bottom were the outcasts, those who handled death or blood, living like shadows in a society that pretended they didn't exist. It wasn't just tradition, it was law. To dream of climbing higher wasn't ambition, it was rebellion, and rebellion could cost you everything. Japan valued harmony, or wa, more than anything. On the surface, it looked like serenity. Villages working in rhythm, families bowing to their ancestors, samurai standing with perfect composure. But harmony came at a price, and that price was your individuality. Every move, every word, every glance had to be measured. Bow too shallowly to the wrong man and you could be branded disrespectful. Speak too freely and your entire family might suffer the shame. It was safer to stay silent, to keep your true thoughts buried, than risk the blade of dishonor. Can you imagine living in a world where your neighbor's whispers had the power to destroy you, where even laughter could be dangerous? That was reality. And yet, here's the paradox that makes this world so haunting. Feudal Japan was breathtaking. The soft petals of cherry blossoms drifting down in spring. The stillness of a tea garden where water dripped like the heartbeat of the earth. The quiet glow of lanterns along a temple path. Art, ritual, poetry. These weren't luxuries. They were survival strategies. Small ways to endure a life chained by duty. Samurai wrote delicate verses about the moon but carried the weight of death in their swords. Lords built exquisite gardens while peasants outside their walls starved. Beauty was everywhere, but it was beauty layered over pain. And that's why, if you or I were dropped into that world, we wouldn't last. Not because we're weak, but because this world demanded an endurance most of us have never even tasted. Could you survive on thin rice porridge day after day, with meat only as a rumor? Could you toil barefoot in flooded fields from dawn until your spine bent like a bowstring, knowing the best of your harvest would be taken as tax? Could you live every day wearing a mask of obedience, bowing until your back ached, while hiding every thought that might betray you? That was the daily reality. So before we let the cherry blossoms fool us, let's remember this. Feudal Japan was not designed for comfort. It was designed for survival. And survival meant silence, obedience, and sacrifice. That's why tonight we begin this journey together, peeling back the romance and stepping into the truth. And by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly why you wouldn't last a single day in feudal Japan. Now let's step out of the castles and temples for a moment and into the muddy heart of Japan, the rice fields. Because if you weren't born a samurai or a noble, chances are you were a peasant. And that meant your life was a cycle of dirt, sweat, and hunger. Imagine waking up with the sun, not because you feel inspired or rested, but because the land tax is due and every grain of rice counts. Your home is a small thatched hut with no real doors or windows, just gaps for wind and rain to creep through. And sometimes even the neighbor's goat wanders in to remind you how little privacy you actually have. Breakfast, if there is one, might be a thin bowl of rice gruel or a scrap of pickled radish from last week. If there's nothing, you just pretend you're not hungry and swallow a splash of cold river water before walking into the mud. The fields look beautiful in travel books, green and shining with water, but for the people who worked them, they were pits designed to break the body. 12 hours of bending, planting, weeding under the blazing sun or in pouring rain. Your feet sink into the muck until your skin cracks. Infections creep in, and your spine feels like it belongs to an old man long before your hair turns gray. And even after all that labor, the harvest doesn't belong to you. You pay your taxes not in coins but in rice, the very thing you need to survive. If the crop is good, the Lord's granaries are full and you and your family eat what's left. If the crop is bad, or if a soldier rides his horse across your plot and tramples half of it, you starve. Complain. That's adorable. You don't complain. Talking back could mean a whipping, exile, or something far more permanent. The truth is, as a peasant, you were the foundation of Japan's economy, the silent fuel behind the beauty and power of the ruling classes. Samurai might have carried swords, but it was your rice that fed them. You were the reason temples had offerings, the reason markets stayed alive, the reason feudal Japan kept turning. And yet you were invisible, forgotten, a nameless worker whose suffering was considered normal, even necessary, and there was no escape. By law, you couldn't just leave your village and look for a better life. You were tied to the land like a prisoner whose chains were made of mud and tradition. When the rare festival came, you seized it. A night of sake, cheap dancing in circles, music that let you forget for a few hours that planting season started again in just days. Those moments of joy were brief, but maybe that's why they mattered so much. Because in a life defined by endless labor and low expectations, even a single night of laughter felt like rebellion. So ask yourself, could you do it? Could you bend your body into the mud every single day, knowing you'd never rise higher, never own more, never see freedom beyond the rice stalks? This was the backbone of feudal Japan, not the samurai with their blades, but the peasants with their blistered hands. And if you or I were thrown into that life, there's no doubt we'd break before the first harvest was even done. So you've crawled back home from the fields, your body aching, your clothes stiff with mud, and your stomach growling like a restless animal. What do you eat? Forget feasts or elaborate spreads. In feudal Japan, meals weren't about indulgence. They were about survival, and survival tasted plain. For most peasants, food meant rice. Rice in the morning, rice at midday, rice at night. If you were lucky, it was real rice. If not, it might be barley or millet pretending to be rice. Once in a while, you might find a turnip or a bitter radish to add some crunch. And if the gods were in a generous mood, maybe a salty pickle on the side. Meat, that wasn't for you. Meat was for the lords and their tables. If a chicken in your yard went missing, well, that was your secret, and you prayed no one noticed the bones in the ashes. Fish made its way into the diet more often, but usually dried, salted, and tough enough to scrape your gums raw. Soup was a common companion, but calling it soup might be too generous. A thin broth of miso, hot water with a couple of floating leaves, sometimes nourishing, sometimes just salt water pretending to comfort you. You drank it anyway because warmth itself was a gift. Now if you were a samurai, things looked a little better, but not as glamorous as you might think. Yes, your meals had more variety. Rice served with vegetables, fish, maybe even game if your lord was feeling generous. But there was a catch. You ate last. Always after your lord, after his guests, after anyone he wanted to impress. That meant cold rice, cold soup, and the honor of watching others eat first while your stomach clenched in silence. Respect mattered more than hunger. Everything was seasonal too, not because people were health conscious or trendy, but because refrigeration didn't exist. When winter came, the fields were bare and your meals shrank with them. Fasting wasn't a choice. It was nature's cruel suggestion. And if you ever had the misfortune of food poisoning, well, medical care in those days wasn't exactly a safety net. The remedy was to lie down, pray to your ancestors, and hope you got better before you became one of them. And here's something that really shows how different their world was from ours. Food wasn't just fuel, it was also a test of discipline. Eating was quiet, ritualized, and respectful. You didn't slurp too loudly in front of the wrong person. You didn't complain about bland rice. You didn't leave scraps in your bowl unless you wanted whispers behind your back. Meals were as much about showing humility and gratitude as they were about staying alive. So ask yourself again, could you do it? Could you live on endless bowls of rice and salted fish, with hunger always just one bad harvest away? Could you eat quietly, gratefully, while watching others feast before you? Food in feudal Japan was sacred, yes, but it was also scarce, fragile, and humbling. It wasn't about flavor. It was about survival. And most of us today, spoiled by choice and comfort, wouldn't make it through a single winter without breaking. So you've eaten your thin bowl of rice and maybe a scrap of dried fish, and for one reckless moment you let your guard down. Someone at the table says something absurd, maybe a clumsy joke, maybe a boastful story, and the thought of correcting them bubbles to your lips. But in feudal Japan, words weren't harmless. Words could kill you. Free speech didn't exist. Your opinion wasn't a right. It was a liability. Speak above your station and you were arrogant. Criticize someone above you and you were insolent. Even within your own home, a son didn't interrupt his father, a wife didn't correct her husband, and no one, absolutely no one, questioned their lord unless they were ready to explore the afterlife by way of a sword. Every word carried weight, and every silence was a shield. That's why conversation in feudal Japan was slow, careful, measured like footsteps across a frozen pond. A sharp tongue was worse than a dull blade because it could cut your future to pieces. Samurai trained themselves to speak with calm restraint even when burning with anger. Peasants learned to bow their heads and mumble agreement, even when resentment simmered. Humor, that was a dangerous game. Laugh at the wrong thing and you insulted someone's honor. Laugh with someone too important and you might look like you thought yourself their equal. Either way, it could end badly. And when words did slip, there was only one way out: apology. But apology wasn't as simple as saying, "I'm sorry." It was an art form, a ritual drenched in shame. You bowed low, forehead nearly to the floor, sometimes again and again until your body ached. You might bring gifts, perhaps a comb, a bird, or some delicate trinket, hoping it would smooth over the insult. The most skilled apologizers even wrote poems about their regret, verses soaked with humility, praying the offended would forgive. But here's the dark truth. Even a perfect apology didn't guarantee safety. If the person you offended still felt slighted, your groveling might not stop the blade. So imagine living like this, where every sentence felt like walking on knives, where silence was safer than laughter, and where your reputation could crumble over a misplaced word. Could you do it? Could you live in a world where even the sound of your own voice felt dangerous? For most of us, raised to speak freely, to argue, to joke, the answer is no. Our tongues would betray us within hours. In feudal Japan, loose lips didn't just sink ships. They sank families, reputations, and sometimes entire bloodlines. If words could betray you, clothing could condemn you just as quickly. In feudal Japan, what you wore wasn't about style or personal taste. It wasn't about showing your creativity or individuality. Clothing was a uniform of rank, a silent announcement of who you were and how far below others you stood. Your sleeves, your colors, the fabric on your back, they all spoke louder than your tongue ever could. For the samurai, clothing meant silk layered carefully, colors muted but dignified, always arranged to suggest order and authority. Blues, browns, deep reds, every choice a message of discipline and power, and most importantly, the swords. A samurai's paired blades, long and short, weren't just weapons. They were badges of identity, symbols of a right no one else could claim. Wearing them improperly, or daring to carry them if you weren't born to that class, was practically an invitation to be corrected with steel. For peasants, clothing was as plain as their lives. Rough cotton, dyed in muted tones of brown, gray, or beige. Not because they liked minimalism, but because they couldn't afford anything else. Bright dyes cost money, and peasants barely scraped enough to survive. Their robes said one thing: I belong to the mud. These are my only sandals. This is my life. And there was no hiding it. Merchants, even though they had coin, walked a fine line. Too much luxury in their clothing, and they risked looking arrogant, inviting the scorn of the warriors above them. So their robes were finer, yes, but still subdued, rich without being loud. Their trick was to look respectable but never threatening, wealthy enough to be noticed, humble enough to be overlooked. Artisans dressed simply too, their clothes practical, durable, and neat, but never ostentatious. To draw too much attention with fashion was seen as a flaw in itself, a sign of vanity in a culture that prized modesty. And women, perhaps, faced the strictest rules of all. Their hair had to be styled just so, elaborate arrangements that could take hours to prepare, every strand pinned into place. Their kimono patterns changed with the seasons, with rituals, with festivals, each fold and fabric carrying symbolic meaning. To wear the wrong color at the wrong time wasn't a harmless mistake. It could dishonor your family, trigger whispers among neighbors, and mark you as careless or ignorant. Grace wasn't optional. It was mandatory. Imagine living in a world where even the thread on your sleeve could betray your station, where fashion was not freedom but surveillance, and where your clothing reminded you daily of how small your place truly was. That was feudal Japan. Clothing wasn't about self-expression, it was about survival. If clothes told the world who you were, marriage told the world who owned you. In feudal Japan, love wasn't the center of a union. It was a side note, a faint whisper drowned out by duty, politics, and family strategy. People didn't marry for passion. They married for rice, for land, for alliances. If you were a peasant, your parents or the village elder decided who you would marry. Not because they cared about romance, but because they needed strong backs to work the fields and healthy teeth to produce children who could survive. Love. That was a luxury no one asked about. You didn't choose. You were chosen. If you were born into a samurai family, the stakes were even higher. Marriage was not just personal, it was political. A union could solidify a clan alliance, settle a feud, or strengthen a lord's influence. Imagine being 15 years old, handed a scroll of etiquette lessons, taught to write poems with perfect brushstrokes, and then sent off to marry someone you'd barely met. Someone chosen not because of affection, but because your family needed land or your lord demanded loyalty. You didn't walk down an aisle. You were pushed onto a chessboard. And for women, the expectations were crushing. A daughter of the samurai might be trained in calligraphy, in serving tea with flawless grace, in needlework and household management. But all of it had one purpose: to make her a more valuable bride. Her duty was to bear sons, serve her husband, and never let a single complaint slip from her lips. To fall in love outside of this structure, say, with a poet, a musician, or a man beneath her station, was not just scandalous. It was dangerous. Adultery wasn't shameful. It was fatal. A woman could be cast out, disgraced, or worse, executed for dishonoring her family. Romantic love, as we think of it today, stolen glances, passion, secret letters, that belonged to poetry, to plays, to ghost stories whispered in the night. The kind of love that defied rules only existed in tragedies, where doomed couples ended as spirits drifting in the mist. Reality was harsher. Reality was arranged, enforced, and non-negotiable. So could you live in a world where your heart had no vote, where the most intimate choice of your life was made by parents, elders, or lords you couldn't refuse? Imagine bowing to a stranger you now called husband or wife, smiling politely while your heart stayed silent. For us today, it feels suffocating, but for them, it was simply life. In feudal Japan, marriage wasn't about happiness. It was about survival. Education in feudal Japan wasn't about discovery or chasing dreams. It wasn't about a child asking questions, wondering about the stars, or imagining what life could be. No, education was about obedience. It was about preparing you to perform your role without asking why. If you were born into a samurai family, your lessons began early. You learned how to bow properly, how to sit in silence without fidgeting, how to hold a brush and make your handwriting reflect discipline rather than emotion. You studied calligraphy, poetry, tea ceremony, and the art of arranging flowers, not because these things brought joy, but because they revealed your character. A crooked brush stroke meant a crooked soul. A clumsy gesture in the tea house suggested a lack of refinement. Even beauty itself was a test of control. If you were a boy, your lessons went further. Swordsmanship, archery, strategy, the art of war. You were taught to ride horses with a back so straight it looked carved from wood, to fire an arrow with calm precision even as your hands bled. You were told that knowledge wasn't yours, it belonged to your clan, your lord, your ancestors. Curiosity was dangerous. Discipline was everything. For peasants, education was nearly non-existent. A child's classroom was the rice field, the fishing boat, the family craft. You learned how to plant, how to harvest, how to survive. Books weren't for you. Paper was too precious and time was too short. Your education was survival, and that was enough. And women, their training was even more restrictive. From girlhood, they learned sewing, etiquette, cooking, the precise art of pouring tea without a single spill. If they were lucky, they might study a little poetry or calligraphy, but only so long as it didn't interfere with their duty to fold laundry with spiritual precision. Women weren't educated to grow. They were educated to serve. Think about that. Imagine growing up in a world where learning wasn't a gift but a leash, where you memorized rituals not to enrich your soul but to avoid disgrace, where every lesson reminded you not to stand out but to fit in. Education wasn't freedom, it was performance. And failure at that performance wasn't just embarrassing, it could stain your family's reputation for generations. Could you do it? Could you live in a place where knowledge wasn't a path to freedom, but another cage to keep you still? For us, learning is about opportunity. For them, it was about obedience. And in feudal Japan, obedience was everything. Culture in feudal Japan looked graceful from the outside, but living inside it felt like walking across a stage where every move could be judged. What we think of today as art or tradition, the tea ceremony, flower arranging, calligraphy, poetry, weren't hobbies. They were performances with consequences. Take the tea ceremony. To the outsider, it looks calm, peaceful, almost meditative. A host pouring tea in silence, a guest bowing in gratitude, steam curling from the cup. But beneath that stillness was a minefield. Every motion was choreographed. How you knelt, how many times you turned the cup, the pace of your bow, the quiet tone of your thanks, all of it had to be perfect. A sip taken too quickly, a bow delivered too shallow, and whispers would follow you like shadows. People would say you lacked refinement, that your spirit wasn't aligned, that your family hadn't taught you properly. And in a world obsessed with honor, whispers were heavy enough to crush. Calligraphy was the same. A brushstroke wasn't just ink on paper. It was your soul on display. Too sloppy and people decided you were undisciplined. Too rigid and they said you were cold. Even poetry, the seemingly free space of imagination, came with chains. A haiku wasn't just 3 lines. It had to be seasonal, restrained, subtle, carrying the right metaphors and references without ever becoming too personal or too bold. Step too far in one direction and you were dismissed as childish. Step too far in the other and you were accused of arrogance. Even flower arranging, which to us might seem like a quiet pastime, carried enormous weight. Place a blossom out of season, tilt a stem at the wrong angle, and suddenly you weren't simply clumsy, you were culturally defective. Beauty wasn't effortless here. It was a battlefield fought in silence and symbolism. And that's the real paradox. The art of feudal Japan produced things so delicate, so breathtaking, that even centuries later the world still admires them. Yet for the people living it, those same arts were cages, reminders that nothing in their lives was truly free. Every poem, every blossom, every cup of tea was another test to prove they could endure the suffocating pressure of discipline. So ask yourself, could you do it? Could you live in a place where even beauty became another battlefield, where art wasn't about joy but about survival, and where the price of getting it wrong wasn't just embarrassment but the slow erosion of your reputation? In feudal Japan, the pursuit of beauty was never gentle. It was sharp, exacting, and unforgiving. If art was a battlefield of refinement, then the life of a samurai was a battlefield of survival, bound by a code so strict it could strangle you before an enemy's blade ever did. We imagine the samurai as warriors drenched in glory, standing tall beneath cherry blossoms, swords gleaming in moonlight. But the reality was far harsher. To be a samurai was not about freedom or adventure. It was about carrying the crushing weight of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido wasn't a suggestion. It was law written into your very blood. It dictated how you stood, how you walked, how you bowed, how you breathed. Your life didn't belong to you. It belonged to your lord, your clan, your ancestors, and even the tailor who stitched your robe. You were expected to embody honor so perfectly that even a sneeze at the wrong time could be considered disrespectful. And dishonor, it wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was death. Not a battlefield death, but one you inflicted upon yourself. Seppuku, ritual suicide, was not some rare, tragic spectacle. It was an ever-present shadow hovering over every samurai life. Fail your lord, dishonor your ancestors, lose a duel, even speak out of turn. You might be handed a short blade, a quiet room, and the expectation to cut your own belly open with dignity. Imagine living every day with that possibility hovering like a ghost over your shoulder. Training never ended. From childhood, you were drilled in swordsmanship, archery, horsemanship, and tactics. But you were also expected to master calligraphy, poetry, philosophy, and strategy. You trained your body until it broke, and then you trained your spirit until it bent into silence. You laughed softly, if at all, because joy was unrefined. You never showed fear. You never showed doubt. You wore your armor like a second skin, but the heaviest burden you carried was invisible, the constant demand to be perfect. Even your swords weren't just tools of war. They were mirrors of your soul. A nick on the blade was a stain on your honor. A dirty sheath meant disrespect. A misplaced gesture while drawing it, and you didn't just embarrass yourself, you embarrassed your entire bloodline. A samurai didn't merely fight with steel. He lived inside it, a prisoner bound to two blades, one long, one short, each whispering the reminder that mistakes had no mercy. So ask yourself, could you carry that weight? Could you live in silence, in restraint, in constant fear that a single wrong word, a single wrong glance could demand your life? We see the armor and the katana and call it noble. But for those who wore it, every sunrise was another day of walking a tightrope strung over death. Being a samurai wasn't glory. It was discipline sharpened to the point of agony. Take off the armor, set aside the blades, and look instead at the women of feudal Japan. Their lives were no less bound by duty, though their cages were woven from silence and expectation rather than steel. From birth, a girl's future was already written, not in ink or on scrolls, but in the whispered agreements of fathers, the nods of elders, and the unyielding rhythm of tradition. For daughters of samurai families, education meant grace. They learned to kneel without wobbling, to bow without hesitation, to pour tea so flawlessly that a drop never dared to spill. Calligraphy, poetry, and music might be added to their training, but always as ornaments to make them more desirable brides. A young woman's worth wasn't measured by her dreams. It was measured by her obedience, her silence, her ability to move through the household like a shadow that served without complaint. Marriage wasn't a choice. It was an arrangement, a transaction, a way to bind families and cement alliances. A girl of 15 might suddenly find herself dressed in elaborate layers, face powdered pale, and presented to a man twice her age because her union could bring more rice fields or political stability. Her job was to bear sons, run the household, and never let her voice rise above a whisper. Love, that belonged to theater plays, to tragic ghost stories, to poets who could indulge in longing without consequence. For real women, romance was dangerous, even deadly. To fall for the wrong person wasn't scandal. It was betrayal, and betrayal often ended in blood. Even peasants' daughters weren't spared the weight of expectation. Their days began with chores, cooking, mending, planting, carrying water, raising children, all while maintaining a delicate balance of deference to husbands, fathers, and elders. They weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to travel freely. In many ways, they weren't allowed to be individuals at all. And yet, within these confines, women carved out quiet forms of resilience. Some became poets, hiding their voices in delicate verses. Others ran households with steel hidden beneath silk, wielding influence through whispers and careful gestures. A few even learned the ways of the naginata, a curved polearm often considered a woman's weapon, meant to defend home and family when men were away. They rarely received credit, but their presence was essential. Still, the truth remains, a woman in feudal Japan was never free. She was bound by the will of her family, her husband, her society, and even her clothing. Her silence was demanded, her obedience expected, her individuality erased. So ask yourself, could you live that way? Could you carry yourself with perfect grace while your voice was caged? Could you live your life as a vessel for others' honor, others' ambitions, others' bloodlines? In a world that bowed to men and punished defiance, women survived with quiet strength. But survival wasn't the same as freedom. Every society has its shadows, and in feudal Japan those shadows had names: the Ida, the Hinin, the Untouchables. These were the people who lived outside the rigid class pyramid, not beneath it, but beyond it, exiled to the margins. Society depended on them, but pretended they didn't exist. The Ida were tasked with work considered spiritually tainted, butchering animals, tanning hides, handling corpses, carrying out executions. Without them, there would be no leather for armor, no meat in the markets, no functioning justice system. Yet the same samurai who wore their leather scowled at them in disgust. The same lords who demanded executions turned their backs as if the executioner himself were a disease. They were ghosts with jobs seen when needed, invisible when not. Then there were the hinin, beggars, street performers, those branded as criminals or outcasts. They lived on society's edge, scraping by with odd jobs or entertainment, tolerated only because someone had to fill the cracks no one else would touch. They weren't part of the order. They were reminders of what happened when you slipped. Imagine being born into one of these groups. Before you could even walk, your fate was sealed. You couldn't marry outside your caste. You couldn't rise through merit. No matter how skilled, how hardworking, how clever you were, your blood was a permanent mark. And if someone of higher rank brushed against you, you carried their disgust like a stain that soap could never wash away. It's easy to think of feudal Japan as a world of samurai and poets, of rice fields and cherry blossoms. But it was also a place where whole communities were walled off, condemned to live in villages outside the main towns, their very existence whispered about like a curse. And here's the cruel irony. Society needed them. The same people shunned for impurity were essential for survival. Their labor kept the clean clean. Their suffering allowed others to live in comfort. Could you endure that? Could you wake each day knowing the world required your work but despised your touch? Could you accept that your children and their children would inherit exile not because of what they did but because of who they were? That was the life of the outcasts, a life lived in plain sight, yet erased at every glance. For all the rigid rules and suffocating hierarchy, one thing set feudal Japan apart from much of the world at the time: its obsession with cleanliness. To the Japanese, dirt wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dishonorable. Purity wasn't a preference, it was a duty. But don't imagine warm baths and lavender soap. No. A peasant's morning began with a splash of ice-cold water drawn from a stream or well, water so frigid in winter it felt like knives on the skin. Soap, if you had it, was crude and scratchy, made from ash or rice bran. For most, washing was less about comfort and more about enduring discomfort without complaint. Communal bathhouses existed in towns and villages, heated with firewood, filled with steam and chatter. But here's the catch: there was no privacy. You bathed shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, elders, in-laws, and sometimes even your landlord, all of you stripped bare, all of you pretending this wasn't awkward. First you scrubbed, then you soaked, and woe to the one who dirtied the water. That was more than rude, it was social suicide. Samurai lived under even tighter scrutiny. A warrior could be inspected at any time by his lord, and his body was expected to be spotless. Dirty fingernails, a wrinkled robe, uncombed hair, these weren't small lapses. They were dishonor. Too much body odor during a bow, and you might not rise again. Bathing, grooming, even the scent of your skin became rituals of discipline. A samurai wasn't just expected to fight like steel. He had to look polished enough to reflect his lord's pride. And women, their standards soared even higher. Hair was styled into elaborate shapes that took hours to perfect. Skin was expected to smell of blossoms, robes pressed without a crease, every layer arranged with symbolic meaning. Even while pounding rice or hauling water, a woman was judged by whether her appearance betrayed effort or maintained grace. Cleanliness then wasn't freedom. It was another battlefield, another way society measured your worth. Imagine shivering at dawn, scrubbing your body with freezing water, all while knowing your neighbors, your elders, or your lord could mark you as shameful if you failed. Could you endure that kind of relentless watchfulness? In feudal Japan, even your own skin was a stage, and everyone was watching. For all the hardship, there were rare moments when the rigid order of feudal Japan loosened, if only slightly. Festivals, bursts of color, sound, and sake that broke through the monotony of duty. Imagine a village square lit with lanterns, drums pounding like thunder, and people who spent their days bowed in silence suddenly laughing, dancing, and singing under the night sky. But even here, joy came with rules. For peasants, festivals meant a chance to drink, to eat a little better than usual, to forget the mud of the rice fields for just a night. Sake flowed freely, often brewed thin and weak but enough to warm bellies and blur sorrow. Men and women danced in circles, their steps old as memory, their songs echoing the fields they worked. And yet hanging over every laugh was the knowledge that planting season was only days away. That joy was borrowed time. For samurai, festivals were a paradox. They attended with dignity, their armor replaced by layers of silk, their swords still at their side. They were expected to participate, to show face, but never to lose control. A samurai who drank too much, who laughed too loudly, who forgot his station even for a moment could face whispers that spread faster than fire. Even in celebration, discipline never left them. Their smiles were measured, their steps restrained. Religious festivals tied to Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples carried deeper meaning. Fireworks weren't just entertainment, they were offerings to the gods. Dances weren't simply for fun, they were prayers turned into movement. Every ritual carried layers of symbolism, blessings for the harvest, protection from disease, renewal for the soul. The divine was never far away, even in the midst of revelry. And then there were the darker festivals, where the line between celebration and chaos blurred. Nights when drunken brawls broke out, when men staggered home with bruises, when debts were gambled away beneath lantern light. For peasants, these festivals were rare escapes. For women, they were moments of both freedom and risk. A chance to laugh in public, but also a reminder of how quickly laughter could turn into danger. So could you live that way? Could you dance in circles knowing tomorrow you'd be back in the fields, or sip sake knowing your lord might still be watching your posture? Festivals in feudal Japan were like sparks in the dark, brief, brilliant, but gone before you could truly hold them. If festivals were fleeting sparks of joy, food was the constant shadow of survival. In feudal Japan, meals weren't about indulgence. They were about endurance. Every grain of rice, every sliver of fish, every pickled root was a reminder that life balanced on scarcity. For peasants, rice wasn't just food. It was currency, tax, tribute. Most of what you harvested went straight into the hands of your lord. What remained had to stretch across seasons. Breakfast was often thin rice porridge with perhaps a pickle or turnip on the side. Lunch, more rice. Dinner, rice again, sometimes barley or millet pretending to be rice when harvests were lean. Meat was a rarity, often only appearing during festivals or when an animal happened to die at the right time. Fish was more common, but usually dried and salted, sharp enough to scrape the gums. Soup existed too, but don't imagine hearty stews. It was usually hot water flavored with miso or vegetables, little more than warmth in a bowl. Samurai ate better, but with a twist. Their meals came after their lords, after honored guests, after anyone higher in rank. Cold rice, cooled soup, and the performance of waiting patiently while others feasted was as much a ritual of discipline as it was a meal. Even the privilege of eating could become a test of obedience. And everything was seasonal, not because it was fashionable, but because it was inevitable. There was no refrigeration, no imports from across the sea. Winter meant scarcity, fasting disguised as discipline. Spring brought shoots and wild greens. Summer offered fresh fish and vegetables if you could afford them. Autumn meant harvest festivals, but also heavier taxes that stripped the surplus from peasants' homes. Hunger was a rhythm as predictable as the seasons themselves. Food theft was treated harshly. Steal a handful of rice and you weren't just punished, you could be executed, your disgrace displayed publicly as a warning. Hunger was no excuse. The law valued order above survival. And tea, which we often romanticize today, wasn't about quenching thirst. The tea ceremony was a performance of posture and humility, a ritual of silence that had more to do with honor than refreshment. Drinking tea wasn't about flavor. It was about showing you understood your place. So ask yourself, could you live that way? Could you survive on bowls of rice and pickled roots, knowing every meal was measured, every bite a calculation of survival? For us, food is culture, pleasure, choice. For them, food was duty. To eat was to endure. If food was survival, taxes were the chain that made survival nearly impossible. For peasants, the rice they grew was never truly theirs. From the moment a seed touched the soil, its destiny belonged to someone else. The lord, the clan, the system, everyone took their share before the farmer could feed his own children. Imagine rising with the sun, trudging into fields that were more mud than earth, working until your back curved like a bow. You plant, you weed, you sweat under summer heat, you pray that storms don't drown your crop or locusts don't strip it bare. And when harvest finally comes, when golden fields whisper of relief, the tax collectors arrive. They don't care about the weather. They don't care if your children are coughing from hunger. They measure bushels, tally bundles, and take their portion with cold precision. If you give too much, your family starves. If you hide even a little, you risk being labeled a thief or a traitor. Punishments were brutal. A farmer caught skimming from his own harvest might be flogged, exiled, or even executed. Complaining wasn't an option. Talking back to authority was like asking for death. The cruelty was that peasants were the foundation of the entire system. Without them, samurai had no rice, merchants had no goods to trade, artisans had no buyers. Yet peasants lived like prisoners bound to the land. They couldn't leave their village without permission. They couldn't change their status. They couldn't dream of something better. Generational suffering was baked into the soil alongside the seeds. And if by some chance you became a village elder, don't think that meant power. It meant more responsibility without more respect. You'd be consulted, sure, but only so your words could be ignored. Your authority was little more than decoration, a way to make peasants police one another while the lords pulled the strings. Festivals gave brief escape, but the rice fields were always waiting. Mud clung to ankles, taxes clung to lives, and the weight of obligation pressed down like the summer sun. Could you live in a world where your labor fed everyone but yourself? Could you accept a life where even in your own home, the rice in your pot carried someone else's name? That was the reality for peasants. Their sweat-filled granaries, but their stomachs stayed empty. In feudal Japan, silence was often safer than speech. Words were not free. Every sentence carried weight. Every syllable could tilt the balance of your fate. Today, we take for granted the freedom to crack a joke, argue with a friend, or even question authority. Back then, those same things could cost you your life. Imagine sitting at a low table sharing a modest meal. Your lord recites a haiku that makes no sense, or a village elder mutters a superstition about the weather. You know it's foolish. You feel the urge to correct them. But in feudal Japan, your opinion wasn't just unwanted, it was dangerous. A single careless remark could be taken as insolence, arrogance, or defiance. The wrong word spoken to the wrong person could brand you dishonorable. And dishonor was a debt often paid in blood. Samurai were trained not just in swordsmanship, but in restraint of the tongue. They spoke in measured tones even when furious because an outburst might be seen as weakness. A sharp tongue was worse than a dull blade. A clumsy joke, a sarcastic comment, even laughter at the wrong time could force someone else to restore their honor, often at your expense. For women, the rules were even stricter. A daughter never interrupted her father. A wife never corrected her husband. A young girl learned early that silence was her shield, obedience her survival. To speak too freely was to risk shame not only for herself but for her entire household. Apologies became an art form. A simple sorry would never do. You bowed, you prostrated yourself, you wrote poems about your shame, you offered gifts, sometimes even a live bird or a crafted comb, just to prove your sincerity. And even then, forgiveness was not guaranteed. Sometimes, an apology was only the prelude to punishment. So people learned to smile, to nod, to let their opinions die quietly in their throats. They laughed softly at the right moments, kept silent when unsure, and prayed that their words never wandered where they shouldn't. Could you live in that kind of world, where every conversation was a tightrope walk, every word a test, and silence the only safe companion? In feudal Japan, the walls had ears, and even whispers could cut deeper than blades. In feudal Japan, you didn't need to introduce yourself. Your clothing spoke for you. Before you even bowed, before you opened your mouth, the cut of your sleeve, the color of your robe, the quality of your sandals announced exactly who you were, and how far beneath others you stood. Fashion wasn't self-expression. It was classification. For the samurai, dress was as much a weapon as the sword at their hip. Layer upon layer of silk robes draped with deliberate precision. Colors muted but powerful, deep blues, earthy browns, flashes of crimson. Each choice signaled rank, wealth, and readiness. And then always the daisho, the paired long and short swords, more than steel. They were symbols of authority. To wear them improperly was not a mistake, it was a humiliation. To draw them recklessly could mean death, even if no one fell to your blade. Peasants had no such luxury. Their wardrobe was the color of dirt and ash, brown, gray, beige. Cotton if they were lucky, hemp if they were poorer still. Not because they preferred simplicity, but because dye cost money and survival came before beauty. Their clothes said, "I work the land, I carry the weight, I own nothing." Merchants, though wealthier, lived in a strange contradiction. They had money but low social rank, so they dressed in muted silks, fine but restrained. They were masters of modest luxury, careful never to flaunt too much. A merchant who looked richer than a samurai risked more than envy. He risked punishment. Artisans and craftsmen dressed in durable fabrics, garments that could withstand work while still appearing neat. Their clothing was not meant to draw attention, only to show they had discipline, order, respectability. To stand out was to invite judgment, and in a culture built on hierarchy, judgment was dangerous. And then there were women. For them, fashion was another cage lined with silk. Kimono patterns were tied to seasons, festivals, and social status. Wear the wrong flower motif at the wrong time and you dishonored your family. Hairstyles were elaborate architectural feats, sometimes taking hours to build, each fold and pin a code others could read. A woman's robe might carry 12 separate layers, each carefully arranged, each whispering obedience and refinement. Even beauty could betray you. Too much color suggested vanity. Too little suggested neglect. And for women of samurai families, their appearance was not their own, it was their fathers', their husbands', their clans'. Their body became a billboard for someone else's honor. So ask yourself, could you live under that kind of scrutiny? Could you wake each morning knowing that even the fabric on your back, the way your hair sat on your head, could decide whether you were respected or ridiculed? In feudal Japan, your appearance wasn't just clothing. It was survival. If clothing told the world who you were, marriage told the world where you belonged. In feudal Japan, love was not a choice. It was an arrangement, a contract, a transaction. Romance, the kind with stolen glances and whispered confessions, belonged to poems and theater. Real life was about alliances, taxes, and stability. For peasants, marriage was often decided by parents or village elders. Compatibility wasn't measured in affection, but in sturdiness. Strong arms for farming, healthy teeth for survival, hips wide enough to bear children, these were the qualities that mattered. A daughter's wedding wasn't a celebration of love. It was a calculation. Which family could share the burden of rice, which union would keep the harvest secure. For the samurai class, the stakes were higher. Marriage was strategy. A daughter's hand could cement alliances between clans, secure land, or even end old grudges. A son's bride could bring dowries that bolstered power. A young girl of 15 might find herself in ceremonial robes, face powdered pale, handed off to a man she barely knew, because her union served politics. Her personal desires were irrelevant. Her silence was expected. Her obedience demanded. Women bore the heaviest weight. A samurai wife had to master etiquette, calligraphy, needlework, and the art of serving tea with flawless precision. Her role was to maintain grace, manage the household, bear sons, and never question her husband. Falling in love with someone outside that arrangement was not just scandalous, it was dangerous. Adultery could mean exile, disgrace, or death, sometimes at the hands of your own family. And yet, the longing for love never vanished. It surfaced in the margins, in secret poems, in theater plays about doomed lovers, in whispered stories of passion punished by fate. The famous no-dramas and later kabuki plays often told of men and women who defied duty for love, only to be crushed by society. These weren't simply entertainment. They were warnings. Love was beautiful, but love was dangerous. Could you live that way? Could you marry without choice, bind your life to someone you did not love, and accept that your heart was never yours to follow? In feudal Japan, love wasn't a freedom. It was a liability, one that could cost you everything. Art in feudal Japan was never just art. It was a mirror, a test, sometimes even a trap. Every brushstroke, every verse of poetry, every fold of a kimono carried meaning, and meaning could be dangerous. Take poetry. A haiku wasn't just a handful of words about blossoms or the moon. It was a performance of refinement, a coded signal of your discipline and inner spirit. Too plain and you were called dull. Too clever and you were accused of arrogance. Too passionate and suddenly you lacked restraint. Imagine writing 3 lines and realizing your reputation might hang in the balance. Calligraphy was the same. Ink wasn't just ink. A single crooked stroke could brand you careless, unstable, unworthy. Your handwriting revealed your soul, or so they believed. And in a society obsessed with order, the slightest tremor of individuality could be interpreted as spiritual decay. Even flower arranging, seemingly harmless, was a battlefield of precision. One misplaced blossom and whispers began. Your family might be mocked, your manners questioned, your reputation stained. And remember, in feudal Japan, reputation wasn't cosmetic. It was survival. The tea ceremony turned the simple act of drinking into a crucible of etiquette. Guests sat in silence, movements choreographed, gratitude expressed in hushed tones. Too slow, you were clumsy. Too fast, you were arrogant. Bow at the wrong moment and it wasn't just awkward, it was disgrace. What we imagine as serenity was, for them, a minefield and theater. The stage gave voice to what real life denied. Kabuki and no plays told stories of passion, rebellion, and tragedy. Lovers who dared to defy their families, warriors undone by pride, women caught between duty and desire. Audiences wept and marveled, but everyone knew these were stories they could never live. Theater was a release, a mirror reflecting truths that daily life refused to allow. Could you live under such scrutiny? Could you risk being judged for how you poured tea or folded silk? Creativity should free the soul. In feudal Japan, it often chained it tighter. Beauty wasn't effortless. It was dangerous. And one misstep could turn elegance into shame. By now, you can see the pattern. Feudal Japan was beautiful, but that beauty came at a price. Every detail of life, the way you ate, the way you spoke, the way you dressed, the way you even poured a cup of tea, was wrapped in ritual and watched by others. Perfection was the expectation. Deviation was the danger. It's tempting to romanticize it all. The cherry blossoms drifting in the wind, the soft lines of calligraphy, the serene stillness of a tea house. But those things weren't effortless. They were enforced. They were the product of a society that demanded precision in every breath. To live in feudal Japan was to live in constant awareness that a single misstep, too much laughter, A wrinkle in your robe, a word spoken out of turn, could brand you dishonorable. Samurai bore the burden of Bushido, where failure meant ritual suicide. Peasants carried the weight of endless taxes, their backs bent beneath fields that fed everyone but themselves. Women lived in silence, their futures dictated by fathers and lords, their worth measured in obedience. And the outcasts, the Ida and Hinin, lived as ghosts, essential yet erased. From the outside, the system looked harmonious. Everyone knew their place. Order prevailed, but inside it was suffocating. Individuality had no space. Freedom had no name. The clan mattered. The lord mattered. The land mattered. You bowed, you endured, you obeyed. So, ask yourself, would you last a day in feudal Japan? Could you rise before dawn, wash in freezing water, kneel with perfect posture, harvest rice you weren't allowed to eat, bow without error, dress without flaw, speak without slipping? Could you survive in a world where beauty was discipline and discipline was survival? That's the brilliance and the tragedy of feudal Japan. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to endure. Its order lasted centuries, carved into the bones of a people who carried honor like armor and silence like a second skin. It was breathtaking. It was brutal. And for most of us, it would break us before the sun set. As suffocating as feudal Japan could be, it wasn't the only world where survival demanded impossible obedience. Across the seas, in another age, another woman was testing the limits of what society believed possible. Her name was Artemisia of Caria, and in many ways, she was everything Japan would never allow a woman to be. Picture this: the Mediterranean shimmering blue and violent all at once. On its waters sailed not only the empires of Persia and Greece, but also a queen commanding her own fleet. Artemisia inherited power in Halicarnassus, a city along the coast of Asia Minor. By the rules of her time, she should have been a placeholder, a widow expected to pass power to the nearest male relative. Instead, she kept the throne. She didn't just rule, she fought. When Xerxes, king of kings, launched his invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, Artemisia stunned the ancient world. She didn't send food or money. She brought 5 ships of her own and captained them herself. Imagine the sight. A woman in armor, her banner flying beside the armies of Persia, cutting through waters dominated by men who barely concealed their disbelief. And she wasn't decoration. She wasn't a token. She was sharp, decisive, brutally pragmatic. In war councils, where seasoned generals tried to flatter Xerxes with easy promises, Artemisia gave him the advice he didn't want but needed to hear. Avoid a direct naval battle in the narrow straits. The Greeks know those waters. They'll tear you apart. Xerxes ignored her. And when the Battle of Salamis turned into a disaster, her warning rang louder than ever. But Artemisia's legend wasn't built only on words. In the chaos of that battle, chased by a Greek ship, she made a decision so ruthless it still divides historians. She rammed and sank another Persian vessel, an ally's ship. The Greeks, thinking she must be on their side, broke off pursuit. Xerxes, watching from a hilltop, reportedly exclaimed, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." Praise wrapped in irony, but praise all the same. When the Persians limped home, battered and humiliated, Artemisia returned with her reputation sharpened. While other commanders fell into disgrace, she rose higher. Xerxes trusted her with his heirs, a responsibility no king gave lightly. She wasn't just a survivor, she was indispensable. Now imagine this, a woman in feudal Japan trying the same. commanding ships, speaking bluntly to lords, risking lives by her own judgment. She would never have been allowed near the council chamber, let alone the battlefield. Artemisia's existence feels almost impossible because her world, like Japan's, wasn't built for her. And yet she carved out power anyway. She didn't need beauty to rule. She didn't need softness to earn respect. She bent the game to her will, proving that even in an age where men wrote the rules, some women were willing to break them and win. The Battle of Salamis should have ended her career. Persia's navy was broken, Xerxes' pride wounded, and most of his commanders either dead, disgraced, or forgotten. But Artemisia, she emerged untouchable. She had warned him. She had fought with cunning. And when others drowned, she sailed home with her fleet intact. Xerxes, the man who ruled an empire stretching from India to Egypt, turned to her not as a curiosity but as his most trusted advisor. He asked her what no emperor ever liked to ask, "What should I do now?" And she told him what no sycophant dared to say, "Retreat, return to Persia, leave the campaign to others. You've already burned Athens. Don't tempt the fates." It was brutal honesty, but Xerxes listened. That decision alone reshaped history. Think about it. The fate of an empire swayed not by flattery, not by force, but by a queen's blunt counsel. When Artemisia returned to Halicarnassus, she wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was a legend in the making. Herodotus, the so-called father of history and a native of her city, recorded her deeds with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He described her not as a gentle queen but as something rarer, competent, cunning, calculating. He admitted almost grudgingly that she often outthought and outmaneuvered the men around her. But legends are never safe. With time, her story twisted. To some Greeks, she became a traitor, a woman who had betrayed her people to fight for Persia. To others, she was a Medusa in armor, dangerous and unfeminine. Later myths softened her into tragedy, inventing stories of unrequited love and despair, tales of her throwing herself into the sea for a man who rejected her. It was easier, apparently, to imagine her dying for love than living for power. And yet, through all the distortions, one truth survived. Artemisia had been real. She had commanded ships. She had spoken with kings. She had won respect in a world where women weren't supposed to even sit at the table. That truth was enough to unsettle centuries of historians. Think about it. Feudal Japan built an entire system designed to keep women silent, obedient, invisible. Artemisia shattered those same expectations across the sea. What terrified men most wasn't just her brilliance. It was the possibility that she wasn't unique. If one woman could do it, why not others? A century after the first, Artemisia carved her name into history with steel and strategy. Another woman bearing the same name would echo her power, but this time, not on the sea. Her stage was stone. Artemisia, Roman II of Caria, inherited the throne of Halicarnassus after the death of her husband, who was also her brother, a tangled web of dynastic politics that the ancient world often considered normal. Where her namesake had commanded ships in the heat of war, this Artemisia chose to build something that would defy time itself. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Picture it, a towering marble tomb rising above the city, gleaming white in the Aegean sun. Columns wrapped around it like the ribs of a giant. Statues of gods and warriors lined its tiers, and at the top, a chariot pulled by stone horses seemed to ride across the sky. It wasn't just a tomb. It was a statement, a declaration that Halicarnassus and its rulers belonged to the memory of the world. But it was more than grief. The mausoleum was politics in marble. It proclaimed continuity, stability, identity. Just as the first Artemisia had proved a woman could lead fleets, this Artemisia proved a woman could build monuments as bold as any emperor's. And through her, the very word mausoleum entered our language. A reminder that sometimes power leaves behind not just stories, but entire structures that shape culture forever. Historians still debate the relationship between the two Artemisiae. Were they directly related, mother and daughter, aunt and niece, distant kin? Or was it simply that the name itself had become so synonymous with authority in Halicarnassus that rulers used it like a crown? Either way, the connection was clear. Artemisia was no longer just a woman's name. It was a title of power. What strikes me most is how their legacies speak across time. One wielded ships, one wielded stone, but both carved out space in worlds designed to erase them. And isn't that the thread that runs through history? In Japan, in Greece, in Persia, women were written out of the script unless they forced their way in. The first Artemisia fought with cunning on stormy seas. The second Artemisia built a wonder that still echoes in our language. Both left behind something undeniable, proof that women could endure, command, and create in ways that could never be fully erased. The trouble with powerful women in history is that they rarely get remembered as they were. Instead, their stories are bent, softened, or twisted until they fit the molds that men found easier to accept. Artemisia was no exception. The first Artemisia, the naval commander, became a kind of riddle for later generations. Some storytellers painted her as a ruthless schemer, others as a tragic figure hopelessly in love. One bizarre tale even claimed she hurled herself into the sea out of heartbreak, a death more suited to a lovesick maiden than a queen who had once stared down the Greek navy. It was easier, perhaps, to imagine her destroyed by passion than strengthened by pragmatism. The second Artemisia, who built the mausoleum, was reduced to a mourner, remembered primarily for grieving her husband so deeply that she drank his ashes mixed with wine. A striking image, but one that strips away her political brilliance. She wasn't only a widow in sorrow, she was a ruler making a statement in marble, using architecture as a weapon of memory and identity. This pattern isn't unique. Across cultures, powerful women are often rewritten as temptresses, villains, or tragic lovers. Cleopatra was reduced to a seductress, though she spoke 9 languages and outmaneuvered Roman generals. Empress Wu Zetian of China was remembered as a tyrant, though she stabilized an empire. Even in feudal Japan, women who showed courage outside the domestic sphere were turned into ghost stories or cautionary legends. Why? Because history, for centuries, was written by men who struggled to reconcile female power with their idea of order. And so they reshaped it. Artemisia, instead of being remembered as a strategist who advised kings, was reimagined as a monster or a maiden. Her intelligence became treachery. Her authority became scandal. But here's the truth. The distortions prove her impact. Nobody bothers to twist the story of someone forgettable. Legends only grow around figures who shook the ground beneath their time. And Artemisia shook it so hard that centuries later, storytellers still couldn't decide whether to fear her, admire her, or bury her under myth. Could you imagine the same happening in feudal Japan? A woman commanding fleets, advising lords, or carving her will in stone. More likely, she'd be written into plays as a ghost, punished for ambition. Her story told not as inspiration but as warning. Artemisia's survival and remembrance remind us how rare and how necessary such figures truly were. While Artemisia carved her defiance into history through ships and stone, other civilizations turned their eyes upward, finding power not on the sea but in the sky. Before telescopes, before satellites, the heavens were humanity's first scripture, a canvas of gods and numbers painted in light. And just as rigid as the codes of feudal Japan, the stars too had their rules. Think of the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, staring at the night sky from flat river plains. To them, the stars were not decoration. They were calendars, compasses, and oracles. They mapped Venus, tracked lunar cycles, and divided time into the 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles we still use today. When you glance at a clock, you're echoing their silent calculations made under oil lamps thousands of years ago. The Babylonians picked up that torch and sharpened it into science. They learned to predict eclipses with eerie precision using the Saros cycle, an 18-year rhythm written in clay tablets. Imagine the awe or terror of telling a king, weeks in advance, that the sun would vanish from the sky. It wasn't magic. It was mathematics wrapped in myth. The Egyptians tied their very survival to the stars. Each year, the Nile's flooding, the event that fed and sustained their world, coincided with the heliacal rising of Sirius. That star wasn't just a light. It was a promise. Their temples and pyramids aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and constellations. The Great Pyramid itself may have been a tomb, but it was also a compass pointing forever to Orion and Sirius, binding pharaohs to the heavens. And then the Maya, deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, built observatories of stone with no metal tools, no wheels, no lenses. And yet their calendars tracked Venus so accurately that their error margin was less than a single day over centuries. Venus wasn't just a planet to them. It was a god of war, its cycle dictating when to fight and when to wait. Their temples cast shadows of serpents during equinoxes, architecture made to move with the sky itself. China treated astronomy not just as science but as statecraft. The emperor's mandate of heaven lived or died by the stars. An unpredicted eclipse could spell the end of a dynasty. So astronomers became guardians of legitimacy, measuring comets, nova, and sunspots with a rigor that would stun Europe centuries later. They even documented a supernova in 1054 CE with such precision that modern scientists traced it to the Crab Nebula. In India, astronomy became philosophy. The Surya Siddhanta spoke of Earth's axial tilt and gravity centuries before Newton. Aryabhata described Earth spinning on its axis when much of the world still imagined it fixed. To them, the cosmos wasn't just cycles to predict. It was a cosmic dance, a mirror of the soul. And the Greeks, they asked why. Why do the planets wander? Why does the sun move as it does? Aristarchus dared to place the sun at the center, a truth ignored for 2 millennia. Hipparchus catalogued stars with astonishing precision, discovering the precession of the equinoxes. Ptolemy built his geocentric model, wrong but elegant, powerful enough to rule thought for 1,000 years. Across the world, without telescopes, without electricity, these civilizations bent stone and shadow into instruments. They aligned temples, carved tablets, and traced patterns not just for curiosity but for survival, for power, for faith. They were not so different from feudal Japan in that sense. Order was sacred. Precision was life. To misread the stars was as dangerous as bowing at the wrong time. If ancient civilizations mapped the skies to impose order, America in the early 1800s did something similar on the ground. The Louisiana Purchase was its own kind of constellation, a sudden rearranging of stars. Only these were rivers, plains, and mountains stitched into the fabric of a young nation's destiny. In 1803, the United States doubled its size overnight. Imagine it, a fragile republic hugging the Atlantic coast, suddenly stretching halfway across a continent from the Mississippi to the Rockies. And all for the bargain price of $15 million, 4 cents an acre. On paper, it was triumph. In reality, it was chaos. Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher-president, had wanted only New Orleans and a slice of land to secure trade. Instead, Napoleon Bonaparte, desperate for money to fund wars in Europe after losing his Caribbean empire to the Haitian Revolution, offered everything. For him, Louisiana had become a burden, indefensible, irrelevant. Better to sell it than watch Britain snatch it away. For Jefferson, the offer was irresistible, but it also gnawed at him. The Constitution didn't say a word about buying land. And Jefferson was a strict constructionist, the kind of man who hated stretching legal limits, but opportunity outweighed hesitation. He signed anyway, bending the rules of his own philosophy. But here's the irony: the land wasn't empty. It was already home to over 50 sovereign indigenous nations, each with histories longer than the United States itself. The deal was inked in Paris, but no native leader was consulted, compensated, or even informed. One day they were sovereign peoples. The next, their homelands had been sold by strangers across an ocean. Lewis and Clark's expedition soon followed, setting out to map the unknown and search for a water route to the Pacific. They cataloged plants, animals, and rivers, guided in no small part by Sacagawea, the young Shoshone woman whose presence signaled peace to wary tribes. Their journals spoke of abundance, fertile lands, rich resources, limitless possibility, but those same notes also marked the beginning of displacement, treaties, and broken promises. For settlers, Louisiana was promise. For native nations, it was trespass. The purchase became the seed of manifest destiny, that belief that the United States was destined, ordained, even to stretch from ocean to ocean. But destiny always has a cost. For indigenous peoples, it meant forced removals, wars, and the slow crushing of sovereignty. For the Republic itself, it planted the seeds of division, because every new acre raised a burning question: would slavery follow westward? The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a land deal. It was a transformation. It turned America from a coastal republic into a continental power. It also revealed a contradiction that still haunts its legacy: expansion fueled by ambition, secured through diplomacy but built on displacement. Like the strict codes of Japan or the rigid mathematics of ancient astronomy, the Louisiana Purchase imposed order, lines on maps, laws over land, treaties carved in ink. But beneath that order was conflict, chaos, and lives uprooted. Expansion is never free. It always leaves shadows. The ink may have dried in Paris, but the real story of the Louisiana Purchase was just beginning, not in palaces or treaties, but in the soil, the rivers, and the lives already rooted in that land. For settlers, it was a blank canvas. They poured westward with wagons and plows, hungry for farmland and freedom. But for native nations, it was a wave of trespass. No one had asked their permission. No one had recognized their sovereignty, Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your homeland had been sold, not by you, not by your people, but by two distant empires who saw you as invisible. That was the reality for tribes like the Osage, the Mandan, the Sioux, and dozens more. Jefferson spoke of assimilation or removal, peacefully if possible, forcibly if necessary. Those words would harden into policy within decades. Treaties came, often written in languages indigenous leaders couldn't read, and just as quickly those treaties were broken. Settlers fenced hunting grounds, plowed sacred spaces, and demanded protection from the very people they had displaced. The government answered with soldiers. Skirmishes turned into wars. Resistance was met with force. It was the beginning of a long, brutal cycle. And then came the other fault line, slavery. New land meant new questions. Would it be worked by free farmers or enslaved laborers? Southern planters saw cotton and sugar. Northern leaders saw opportunity for smallholders. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tried to draw a line across the Louisiana Territory. Slavery permitted south of it, banned north of it. But that line was not peace. It was a fuse. Every new state carved from the purchase threatened to upset the fragile balance between free and slave states, pulling the nation closer to a reckoning. Meanwhile, the land itself changed. Rivers were dammed. Prairies were plowed into checkerboards of farms. The bison herds, once thunder across the plains, were driven toward extinction. What had been an interconnected world of native stewardship became a patchwork of private property and exploitation. Progress for some meant destruction for others. And yet, the purchase also sparked the myths that would define America. The frontier became legend, a place of rugged settlers, daring explorers, and endless opportunity. St. Louis, New Orleans, and countless other cities grew into bustling centers of trade. The Mississippi became an artery of commerce, carrying grain and cotton to global markets. The young republic had found its confidence, its sense of destiny. But beneath that confidence was contradiction. The Louisiana Purchase embodied America's highest ideals: opportunity, growth, independence, and its deepest failures: dispossession, slavery, environmental ruin. It was both triumph and tragedy, written across a continent. Think of it like feudal Japan's code of honor, or the ancient astronomers' maps of the heavens. On the surface, order; beneath, struggle. The purchase was no different. It redrew lines, reshaped lives, and left behind a legacy still argued over today. When Jefferson signed that treaty in 1803, he wasn't just buying land. He was rewriting what the United States was. Before the purchase, America was a fragile republic clinging to the Atlantic coast, cautious and young, a nation still proving it could survive. Afterward, it became something else entirely, a continental power, bold and restless, with eyes fixed on horizons it had barely imagined before. The Louisiana Purchase was the first great leap of what would later be called manifest destiny. The idea that America wasn't just meant to exist. It was meant to expand, to stretch from ocean to ocean, to seize opportunity wherever it appeared. And in that single act, Jefferson set the tone for the next century. From Florida to Texas, Oregon to California, Alaska to Hawaii, the United States would repeat the same pattern: acquire, absorb, transform. The Republic had become a collector of continents. But that shift wasn't just political, it was cultural. The purchase fed the myth of the frontier, that endless expanse where dreams could be chased, fortunes found, and identities remade. Stories of explorers and pioneers flooded newspapers. Painters captured vast plains and towering mountains in dramatic landscapes. The West became a canvas for American imagination, a place where men reinvented themselves, where freedom seemed to bloom as wide as the prairies. Of course, that myth always carried a shadow. For every pioneer's dream, there was a native family forced from their land. For every fertile farm, there was a buffalo herd slaughtered, a river redirected, a sacred site fenced off. Expansion was opportunity for some, annihilation for others. And slavery lurked in the background of it all, stretching like a dark cloud over the sunlit plains. Every acre invited the question, would human bondage expand with it? Still, the purchase ignited America's confidence. Suddenly, it wasn't a question of survival, it was a question of destiny. Could a republic govern so vast a land? Could democracy stretch across mountains and rivers? Could the ideals of liberty keep pace with the hunger for territory? These were questions no one had answered before, and yet America pressed forward. Think about it this way. Feudal Japan defined identity through obedience and rigid order. You were born into a role and never left it. The Louisiana Purchase redefined America's identity through expansion. You were born into a republic, but that republic was never meant to stay small. Growth itself became the role. To be American was to move forward, to push boundaries, to seize land, even if it belonged to someone else. It was bold. It was reckless. It was destiny, at least in the eyes of those drawing the maps. Every triumph carries a cost, and the Louisiana Purchase was no different. On maps, it looked clean. A neat block of land transferred from France to the United States with a few strokes of ink. But maps don't show the broken treaties, the shattered nations, or the rivers that ran red when expansion collided with resistance. For native peoples, the purchase was not an opportunity. It was an erasure. One day they were sovereign, the next they were wards of a foreign government they had never chosen. Settlers called it progress. Tribes called it survival. Villages were uprooted, hunting grounds fenced, ceremonies outlawed. Some tried to adapt, farming and trading alongside newcomers. Others resisted with war. Either way, the tide was relentless. By the mid-19th century, removal and reservation became the law of the land, pushing tribes westward again and again until westward itself finally ended at the Pacific. The purchase also deepened the nation's moral fracture. Slavery, already a wound, became a gaping fault line. Every new acre demanded a decision, free or slave. Missouri's admission in 1821 cracked the country down the middle, the infamous compromise line slicing through the very territory Jefferson had acquired. The debates that followed would not stay in Congress. They would explode into war. The Civil War, in many ways, was the delayed cost of Jefferson's bargain with Napoleon. And then came the land itself. The bison, once thundering in herds of millions, were nearly exterminated as settlers plowed the prairies and laid railroads across ancient trails. Rivers were dammed. Forests felled, soil stripped. What indigenous nations had nurtured for centuries as a living system was carved into rectangles, sold and measured not by spirit but by yield. Yet even in its contradictions, the purchase shaped the United States into what it is today. The Mississippi became the nation's artery of commerce. Cities like St. Louis, Kansas City, and New Orleans grew into trade hubs that pulsed with life. The plains fed the world. The resources fueled industry, and the myth of the frontier, the daring explorer, the rugged settler, the wide-open promise became the national story Americans told themselves, even when the truth was far more complicated. So what is the legacy of the Louisiana Purchase? Triumph or tragedy? Growth or grief? The answer is yes to all. It was opportunity born from displacement, liberty entangled with slavery, abundance carved from loss. It made America bigger, stronger, bolder, and it left scars that have never fully healed. Like feudal Japan's rigid codes or the astronomer's precise charts of the heavens, the Purchase imposed order on chaos. But order is never free. Someone always pays the price. So here we are, after traveling from the muddy rice fields of feudal Japan to the stormy seas of Artemisia's battles, from temples aligned with stars to the boundless plains of the Louisiana Purchase. At first glance, these worlds seem far apart, but they all share one haunting truth. Survival has always demanded submission to order, and those who dared to bend or break that order often paid the price. In Japan, life was a script written before you were born. Samurai lived under the blade of honor, peasants bowed under endless taxes, and women moved through life with grace bound tighter than their silk robes. To laugh too loudly, to bow too shallow, to love too freely, any of it could end in ruin. Order was beauty, but it was also a cage. In Artemisia's world, the seas carried empires into collision. She should have been erased by history, but instead she rewrote her place in it. She proved that intelligence, courage, and brutal pragmatism could carve space for a woman in a world ruled by men. And even when later storytellers twisted her into a monster or a tragic lover, her true legacy whispered louder. She played the game of power and won. The ancient astronomers, staring at the night sky without telescopes, saw the same lesson written in starlight. The heavens moved in patterns. They measured them, recorded them, built temples and pyramids to mirror them. For them, to misread the sky was as dangerous as misjudging a lord's temper in Japan. Order, again, was survival. And then there was America, a young republic that bought an empire in one stroke. The Louisiana Purchase turned possibility into policy, expansion into destiny. It gave settlers hope, but for native nations it meant trespass and exile. It carried opportunity, but also slavery, war, and scars on the land itself. Growth, like honor or astronomy, was another kind of order imposed at a cost. So what ties all these stories together? It's the tension between control and chaos, between the rules we're forced to live under and the courage it takes to challenge them. Some, like the peasants of Japan, endured by bending. Others, like Artemisia, endured by defying. Some civilizations sought order in the heavens, others drew it on maps. But in every case, the price of survival was steep and the cost of resistance even steeper. And maybe that's why we're still drawn to these stories. They remind us that life has never been easy, never been fair, never been free of boundaries. Yet within those boundaries, there have always been sparks of defiance, women who refused silence, cultures that mapped the stars with bare eyes, nations that gambled everything on the promise of more. So, would you last a day in feudal Japan? Probably not, but maybe that's the point. These worlds weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for endurance. And in that endurance, they left behind stories of discipline, of tragedy, of brilliance, of ambition that still echo today. Hey guys, if you made it this far, I hope you felt the weight and wonder of walking through those ages. As always, thank you for spending your night with me. Rest well, dream boldly, and remember, history is never just the past. It's the mirror we still look into, whether under a cherry blossom, a starry sky, or the wide open plains. Good night.